welcome everyone. And I'm also thrilled to be part of this terrific panel. And I would like to move along and start by introducing our two climate experts who I hope will tell us everything we need to know about the upcoming climate conference in Scotland that's starting just in a couple of weeks. We have with us Anju Sharma, who's program lead for locally led action at the Global Center for Adaptation and has worked in senior positions at Oxford Climate Policy, the European Capacity Building Initiative, and Oxfam, Great Britain, and is an affiliated researcher at SEI. She's also been a consultant for the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Development Program, Oxford University Center for the Environment, and GIZ, an international collaborative organization. And both at the global and local level, she's worked on management of natural resources like forests, water, and wildlife, as well as rural development, gender governance, civil society engagement, and capacity building, and has developed a good understanding of sustainable development policy, as well as the challenges to implementing it, focusing on climate adaptation and mitigation in developing countries. She has written and edited books, papers, and articles on global governance, climate change, natural resource management, and pollution, including a really valuable guide to the Paris Agreement, done as part of a series for the European Capacity Building Initiative, whose work has especially strengthened voices of the world's least developed countries. And Sivan Kartha is a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environmental Institute, whose research and publications for the past 25 years have focused on equity and efficiency in the international climate regime. He is a member of the Bulletin Science and Security Board and research director of SEI's Equitable Transitions Program, as well as co-director of the Climate Equity Reference Project. He advises and collaborates with diverse organizations throughout the developing and industrialized world, and has worked on several major climate reports relevant to our discussion today, including the as co-leader of the Equity and Sustainable Development section of the IPCC's fifth assessment report in 2014, which was sort of the basis for the Paris Agreement, and now as lead author for the next major IPCC assessment report for the section on mitigation and development pathways. And I'd like to swing right into the discussion of the upcoming Conference of Parties, COP26, and also start by talking about a different kind of global crisis that we've just endured, or actually still enduring, the COVID pandemic. And wanted to ask Anju, we've heard some talk of calls for this conference perhaps not to take place. And I wanted to ask, how has the pandemic affected the state of global climate negotiations with a one-year gap between COP talks? And is COVID still a concern with regard to accessibility at the upcoming conference in Glasgow?
Thanks, Bob, and hello, everybody. Thanks also to the Bulletin for inviting me this evening. Well, it's evening for me, but probably morning for you there. I should probably preface my comments by saying that I speak in my personal capacity and not for the GCA. But Bob, to get back to your question, so it's almost as if, you know, in 2015, we signed the Paris Agreement, and there was a sort of a build-up to say that 2020 is when we begin implementation in earnest. So everybody was lined up at the start line waiting for the gun to go off to start. And that was kind of interrupted. And it was not just climate change, but it was meant to be a decade of action that was supposed to go off when in 2020, including with the Sustainable Development Goals under the UN. But all of that came to a halt because of COVID. And it definitely had an impact because, well, on the one hand, of course, you know, the remaining elements of the Paris Agreement that needed to be decided, and there are quite, well, at least 3 really important ones that remain, those couldn't be agreed. And then you also had the countries that were preparing their so-called nationally determined contributions, which is what they promised to do on climate change. Many of them couldn't complete those and submit those on time, their updated versions. A lot of all countries, the economies of all countries were impacted. So one of the results of that was that the climate finance that was meant to be provided, there was a deadline that developed countries would provide 100 billion by 2020. That didn't happen. The last estimate showed, I think, that they provided about 80%, and climate finance flatlined in 2019, I think. And of course, like the vulnerable countries that were already, you know, suffering the impacts of climate change became even more vulnerable because their economies were hit by COVID, particularly the small island states, because, you know, their tourism was stopped, their access to food and resources. So it's had quite a severe impact. And in fact, despite, you know, the dangers of not having everyone present, at least the small island states were very keen that the conference go ahead in person. They did try to have sessions in between online, but you can't, this sort of negotiation, particularly where there has to be decisions taken, it doesn't really work out that way. So they had a mid-year session where they couldn't take decisions, so to speak, but they prepared. And so we hope that when they come to COP, they will be able to take decisions faster, or at least complete the work that's still pending. So countries go back having a very definite idea what they need to do next. And I'll let Sivan add to that.
I think whenever there's a false start, which is kind of what it was, as you just said, Anju, you know, we're supposed to really get things rolling, it robs momentum. And this is definitely a time when we can't afford to lose momentum because things really are urgent. And so in that sense, it was a real challenge. There's another sense in which the pandemic has been kind of a trial run almost for dealing with climate change. And I mean that in the sense that climate change is this global common problem that we have to address in a cooperative way. And if we don't, then we're not going to manage to really have put in place a robust response to it and deal with it. And so in some ways, the pandemic showed us that we're able to do that in certain ways. In other ways, we're not. We did an amazing job at rallying our technological innovation machinery to come up with a vaccine much more rapidly than had been envisioned. We showed an incredible boldness with regard to putting absolutely necessary financial resources into a critical problem of getting economies back rolling and getting people resources they need just to carry on from day to day. But in other ways, we really didn't meet the grade. International cooperation really did suffer. There are countries that are still struggling to get their people vaccinated, while there are other countries that are moving on to boosters. And so that's the kind of problem that recurs in climate change too. There are vastly different capacities across countries for dealing with this problem. And if we want to deal with it in a way that works globally, that really is sustainable in the sense that it endures over time, we will need more cooperation than that. In Glasgow itself, we're seeing that there are real challenges to how we're dealing with it. There are countries who, since not all of their negotiators have access to vaccinations yet, not all of their observer organizations, civil society members who come and participate as well, it's much more difficult for them to participate. They have relaxed the issue of the quarantine in the UK, but with a quarantine, it's a problem because you can't just take 2 weeks before and after a meeting and sit somewhere. Without a quarantine, it's a problem too, because if you're not vaccinated and you're worried about getting infected in the UK, which has had 45,000 new cases today, and you bring it back home to people who you know and love and are also not vaccinated, that's a problem. And so really grappling with the need for cooperative common solutions is something that I think we've largely shown that we need to come up with some better some just greater commitment to actually doing that.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Bob, Sivan, you're absolutely right. I think what the pandemic showed us on the one hand is that if we need to, we can mobilize the resources and the technology to meet a crisis like this. But also on the other hand, we're just not ready to deal with the kind of global problems that we face today because countries and leaders think within national borders. It's me first between countries. So, you know, all the discussions we've had on access to the vaccine and the earlier fights that happened with PPP, etc. So we're not really thinking globally. We're all thinking very nationally, and that is not how we're going to tackle the big problems of today.
Very true. So this conference is going ahead in the face of the pandemic, the continuing pandemic, and there are some challenges, which leads to a larger question of what should we expect from this COP? I've seen numbers of articles and talked to quite a few people the last few weeks. There was another article this morning in Bloomberg, I think, the conference seen as a last chance to address dangerous climate change. And is that an accurate perception? Or maybe a better question that you can give a detailed answer for is what should we expect? What could we expect from this conference of parties in Glasgow in the beginning of November? What would be signs of success? What do we need to achieve there to show that the world is coming together to address global warming in a meaningful way? Sivan.
As far as whether this is the last chance, it's not the last chance. It's not the last chance because there's never really a last chance. We need to do, you know, as much as we can, but it's also not the last chance to avoid dangerous climate change because that last chance happened quite a long time ago. Dangerous climate change is already happening. People are already suffering from often devastating impacts, and we've seen that all over the place, including wildfires in here in the U.S. and yeah, any number of things we can review grimly. So it's really just a matter of doing everything we can to really seriously take the problem. Glasgow is a negotiations where there are several particular issues that are still open in the negotiations. A lot has been resolved with regard to Paris and its implementation, but there are some open issues. But I would say the biggest thing from kind of the bird's eye view is that Glasgow marks the first sort of the outcome of the first round of stepping back, reviewing what countries put on the table in Paris, deciding how we're doing, and then responding with increased, more ambitious efforts. And that cycle of reviewing and then stepping forward with more, that was considered kind of the innovation of Paris. Instead of trying to lock countries in to specific commitments that put everything on the table right there in Paris, it was understood that countries aren't ready to do that, and we're going to do this iteratively. And this is cycle 0 of that iteration. And the signs so far are that countries are willing to put forward more. There was, according to some, pretty reasonable and rigorous assessments, about 8 gigatons, 8 billion tons of emission reductions that were put on the table in Paris by countries making their pledges in Paris. And over the course of this first round of ramping those up, those have increased by another 3 gigatons. And so, okay, it's increased by, something pushing another 50% of effort, worth of effort. But the problem is that if we really want to get on a track that's consistent with the goals we set in Paris to stop further climate change, we wouldn't need 8 gigatons or 11 gigatons. We'd need something more like 40 gigatons of reductions within this decade. And so there really is a lot more to do. And what this first round of iteration has told us, and maybe in part this is because countries really have been terribly distracted by the pandemic, is that we're still not at a point where we're taking the climate crisis as seriously as the crisis warrants. Anju, what would you add to that?
Yeah, well, so I think that we need to sort of temper our expectations from conferences like this, and remember that the UN is really a sum total of its member countries. So, I see that there are some questions on how effective we can expect this process to be or come up with something. We're certainly not going to get an answer or result that's going to solve climate change for us, at this COP or any COP. And what we have there is what countries have decided. So the only way that we can push ambition, we can push our the world forward, is for each of us to push our governments to, commit to doing more under that process. As Sivan said, it's entirely nationally driven. It's up to countries to be as ambitious as they can and to sort of bring their peers with them to try and convince them to show equal ambition, to show that kind of leadership. That's the sort of game that we're looking at right now, that particularly the countries that have, contributed historically and continue to contribute, take that leadership, show that leadership and say, I can do this, meet me here, try and do more. And the thing is, at the end of the day, the UN and under this process, there's no way that we can hold countries to, what they promise to do or say they will do. So again, we're policing ourselves. And the UN can only sort of enable that or give us the space to decide it. So it's not the effectiveness of the UN as such, but the effectiveness of our governments and even ourselves and our ability to push our governments to make that kind of commitment, which is, as Sivan said, is just not there. Because right now, from all the promises that have been made in the nationally determined contributions by countries, we're not meeting what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wants us to meet, which is to halve emissions by 2030. We're actually having a 16% increase, according to a recent assessment done by the Convention Secretariat. So we've got a long way to go. And really the way we can push that is not to have unrealistic expectations from the UN process, but really to push our governments and enable them to go and make those promises. And as Sivan said, to use the ratchet mechanism within the Paris Agreement to, push each other to do better and better.
Right, it's a voluntary agreement. You have to always keep that in mind. And so no silver bullet in Glasgow for the climate crisis. I know in the past, there's been an expectation of the United States to be sort of a leader on climate, at least among some people. And now we're in a situation where we have the US coming back into the climate talks for the first time in several years because of the political changes here. And I wanted to ask you both about the role of the US coming back in with President Biden seeming to want to take a lead in helping to address this at a global level. how does the rest of the world see US's re-engagement with the UN process at this point? Can or is the United States a leader? Can it really be a driving force for making progress? How do people see that? The people you work with and people you talk to around the world, Sivan?
Yeah, like I say, you can always count on the US to do the right thing after it's exhausted all other possibilities. And the US really has played a schizophrenically a good cop, bad cop role in the negotiations. I think that there are some things that the US has done that has unmistakably been helpful. Just raising the profile of climate on the agenda for much of the 30 years since the climate treaty has been in place, particularly under certain administrations more so than others, and engaging with other countries through its own diplomacy in ways that help to put it onto the profile, and attempting to put together a major emitters forum and that sort of thing. But as far as its own actual efforts toward dealing with climate, it really has been mixed. I mean, the US has done some of the things that it always does, and very strongly, like help with technological innovation. The US is a leader in developing certain technologies, not the world's leader necessarily. Germany, China, Denmark, they're way up there, but it is an important leader. But at the same time, the bottom line kind of is that the US is, last year it was the world's largest producer of natural gas, the world's largest producer of oil, the world's largest consumer of gas, the world's largest consumer of oil. And so as what is still fundamentally a fossil-based economy, it is deeply conflicted about climate change. The US as a country is highly ambivalent about whether this is a problem it wants to solve. There are certain actors within the US who have been working very, very hard to get climate action in place. And there are other actors that are often much better resourced and much more economically and politically powerful that have been working very hard to make sure climate action isn't put in place. So other countries aren't naive when they look at this, and they don't, John Kerry going around the world and exhorting countries to take action, it's not going to be enough. They really do want to see the US taking action. President Biden has tried to do some really important things when he came into office. For example, one of the first things he did was said, we're going to stop leasing public lands for more fossil fuel production. And that's a huge step. We were talking about the gap between where our emissions are going and where they need to go if we're serious about the Paris goals. The gap between where fossil fuel production is going and where it would need to go is even bigger. And so for Biden to come in and say, let's take this seriously, was great. And then that order was stayed by a judge. And since January, Biden has actually been on the Biden administration has been permitting new leases at a quicker rate than the Trump administration had in the previous couple of years. So I got to give it a mixed score at best.
Anju, what could the U.S. bring to the table that would be really helpful in a best case scenario?
Oh, so Bob, this is a long question for me because my first conference was Kyoto, right? And in Kyoto, I worked for an Indian NGO, and our big concern was equity. And when I came to the conference, we were basically told by not just American civil society, but civil society from around the developed world that we shouldn't bring up that question because that would upset the US and they would walk away from the table. But we already knew that the US was sort of restricted in what it could do because of the Bird-Hagel agreement that was passed just before Kyoto, which sort of prevented them from taking on commitments unless developing countries did too. So, I mean, and I think that the Kyoto Protocol was weaker than it could have been, largely because of the role that the US played. Then we had, you know, right after that, the US withdrew. And I think that the amount of understanding that the US got from a lot of the developed countries is remarkable. You know, we never have that kind of understanding of the internal workings of a country for any other, whether it's India or China or others, but we all know why it's such a problem for the US to convince the Republicans, and, you know, everybody understands that, but nobody else gets that kind of understanding. But I mean, it was deja vu all over again, because when the Paris Agreement was being decided, again, you know, the reason why we have such a sort of voluntary treaty where there's no punitive action, and I see somebody asking, you know, if countries can be held to account, not really. And it's, at least I consider, it's the best we could have gotten, but it's weaker in many ways than Kyoto, right? I mean, that's different people have different opinions, but that really is mine. So to me, I think that we've had two big agreements where the US has sort of not played the leadership role that it should have. And I think that it's, again, making the right kind of noises, and everybody has been really patient. I've you know, I can give you the a view from India, where everybody thinks this is hugely unfair, that, you know, the US is in fact a rogue nation. And in the UK, where I live now, where people are far more understanding and say, oh, give them a chance, you know, now we've got Obama, things are going to improve. Now we have Biden, things are going to improve. But I think even now, the EU, for instance, is running out of patience. And I think that people have realized that the EU is not a leader. But having said that, there's a lot of hiding, you know, among other countries as well. So other countries too, there's too much of, you know, of a blame game going on. So the US is blaming China, India is blaming, you know, somebody else. So there's a lot of hiding behind each other. And what we really need is for countries to step up and say, we take responsibility, we recognize this is a global problem, and we're going to do something about it. And I think that's what the US needs to do. As I said, I mean, if you look at the specific promises that the US has made so far, they're an improvement on what, you know, was happening, but it's not enough. Not on finance, not on emissions reductions. It's not on any count, not on, you know, responsibility or even share. So I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned finance, and we have time for one more question in our group before we move on to audience questions. So I wanted to move on to finance and talk a little bit about why it's an important part of the UN climate process, and where we're falling short. What were the promises that were made and are not being met, and how can we improve that, specifically at this COP? I've heard from a few folks from developing countries, you know, going back to my first question about will it be a success or failure, say that if we don't do certain things in the realm of finance at this COP, that they as a group will call out this COP as a failure. So what do we need to do in terms of finance, and where are we falling short? Anju, go ahead and start.
Okay, so if the world was a country, climate change would be a straightforward case of a polluter pays principle and of punitive justice, that you've caused harm, you need to pay for it, right? Unfortunately, that's not an avenue. I mean, that's possible. It's been, I think, called a justice paradox, where the countries that literally they're threatened with losing their nation states, you know, small islands will go under, and people will lose countries, but there's no forum really where they can push for claims or sort of expect any sort of justice. so the only way that we can deal with that whole issue is through this very painful negotiation on finance under the UNFCCC, which, there's a broad understanding that, yes, this is not the same as overseas development assistance. It's climate finance. There's a different nuance to it that, there are countries that have caused harm. There are people who are already vulnerable and are going to suffer even more. And there've been promises made in Cancun when things in Copenhagen, when things were more or less collapsing. Developed countries made a promise of 100 billion by 2020 per year. And 2020 has come and gone, but that promise has not been met. Now, the problem is that, if even the 100 billion is actually a small number compared to needs. If you look at mitigation needs, which is sort of reducing emissions and reducing the threats of climate change, and the adaptation needs, which is dealing with the impacts and how do you address them. Now, increasingly, even loss and damage, which is a damage that is occurred that, you can't adapt to. It's much bigger numbers. But even this amount that was promised, the fact that it's not been given erodes trust hugely in the negotiations. It sort of, because it's happened in the past. At the same time, there was a promise of fast start finance. And the problem is that there's never a clear definition of the terms of this finance, whether it's going to be private sector, whether it's going to be public sector, whether it's going to be loans or grants. Like, many people think that poor countries should not be expected to take loans from the World Bank and others to address a problem that's essentially been inflicted upon them. So these are really difficult questions, and the Paris Agreement kind of ironed over them, because what was said was that they would continue with the goal of 100 billion per year till 2025, and before that they would decide another figure where the 100 billion is a floor. So that's one of the other issues that needs to start at Glasgow, hopefully. And I really hope that they define better what counts as climate finance, because it's very important to trust building in the negotiations, that everybody has the same understanding, and people don't feel that they've been basically shortchanged. So yeah, I would say it's one of the biggest issues in the negotiations now. Sivan, if you want to add on.
I would completely agree. It really is one of the biggest issues, and one might think, well, why isn't actually getting emissions down really unequivocally the biggest issue? And there's a really important almost equivalence between the two, and that it comes down to, I mean, as you started right off, Anju, that with the core of the finance issue is equity, because if you just reduce the climate problem to its bare essence, it's a global commons problem, and we share one common climate. And so we can't, each individually as countries, fix our own climates. We need to rely on international cooperation to do that. And so any country that reduces its own emissions, it's not actually doing that to save its climate. It's doing that as a signal to other countries that it's willing to do its fair share of this whole global common challenge. And doing your fair share and really showing that if you're a country that has been one of the major contributors to the rise in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and if you're one of the countries who has the most financial and technological wherewithal to deal with the problem, then you're ready to step forward and take a really major role. And if countries don't see you doing that, if they don't see your emissions reductions on the table, then they're going to think, I'm not going to be a dupe, and I'm going to invest my scarce resources in adaptation, if anything. And I could be terrified of climate change, but the sensible choice for me wouldn't be necessarily to invest in mitigation, it would be to invest in dealing with the inevitable impacts. Mm-hmm. And so doing your fair share is critical. And at the end of the day, sort of the distribution of ethical obligation for dealing with this problem is overwhelmingly, it's a certain group of high emitting and wealthier countries. And yet, where most of the actual work needs to be done, where most of the actual investment needs to be made, is in the poorer countries, where energy needs are still growing, where emissions are currently higher because that's 2/3 of the world's population or more. And so the only way to square that circle, the ethical obligation is in one place, the action needs to take place somewhere else, is through international cooperation, is through providing the finance, the technology, the capacity building that's needed to enable these countries to decarbonize as quickly as we need them to, in order to solve our climate problem. And so that's why finance is at the absolute core. And the fact that it hasn't really been taken seriously for the 30 years, it's hard for the countries who are really relying on that finance to see that as anything other than a strong signal that, okay, guess these countries aren't interested in doing their fair share.
Right.
If I'm gonna focus on anything, it's gonna be my own small lifeboat.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are going to move on to the Q&A part of this session with the audience, and I'd like to ask Hallie to come back on and lead us through the audience Q&A. I've seen some great questions in there already. There was one related to what you were just talking about, but related to emissions accountability and verification and all those sorts of things. But Hallie, please guide us through some audience questions here.
Great, thanks, Bob. Hello again. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner, and I'm the program manager here at the Bulletin. If you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please put it in the Q&A function so our speakers can see that. And this function can be found at the bottom of your screen. And when you are called on to ask a question, I will send you a prompt to unmute yourself so you can verbally ask the question. Please accept that prompt and then ask one question, please. As a reminder, a recording of this program will be available on our website in the coming days. All right, now let's move on to our first question, who will be Yang Bu Du. All right.
Okay, hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we can.
Yes, and what I haven't really been hearing so much in this conversation is how might we engage subnational governments. And last year, over the course of 2020, much of the conversation, for those of you who tuned into events like Daring Cities and events hosted by ICLE with local governments and all of that, there's a lot of knowledge and experience to be tapped from that level. And yet, from what I see, is there's just so much fixation on what the national governments are doing, where the local and regional governments, especially the major cities, that they can be a lot more agile and nimble in responding to challenges. For example, look at what places such as from cities as large as Paris and Tokyo on one hand, to even small cities like Toyama, Japan, a case study about which I just posted a few times in the chat here of a compact city. So I just wanted to fundamentally that what are some concrete experiences? How might we learn? How might we adapt from those experiences across cities, across contexts, subnational level? Don't have to get permission necessarily from national governments. In fact, they might just sit on their hands until they see something doing some action on a subnational level, and then they're going to follow. So why isn't there that much of more of a conversation of a pull approach vis-a-vis the national government, start at a subnational level, and then as additional subnational units engage, that's eventually sooner or later going to pull those nation state actors in?
I think it's an excellent question, and it's a very important point that, yeah, it's often the smaller jurisdictions where the experience and the knowledge is, where there is some motivation to do something, because it just may be a jurisdiction where they're more concerned about climate change, either because they are suffering the impacts already, or because they're just more aware and motivated to do something about it. So yes, there definitely should be these smaller jurisdictions should be encouraged. I would say at the very least, they shouldn't be discouraged, which in some cases has been happening. Like, for example, California, it's not uncommon that California in the US wants to move forward more quickly, but then under administrations that are hostile to climate change, they're fought in the courts. New York, Massachusetts, California. So at the very least, they shouldn't be prevented from taking the lead. And often it's in these smaller jurisdictions where some really interesting early experimentation is done to help figure out what are the best ways of doing things. Bus rapid transit in Curitiba, or just interesting experiments that have actually gone on to have scaled up and be more widespread. One challenge with this, it's similar at the global level, in that if you have different jurisdictions, there's a certain point at which they start getting anxious about what might be the downsides of moving forward too quickly. If you've got 50 US states that are all competing to attract business, or are trying to keep their taxes low, or are, there to some extent, there's a concern that they don't move too far ahead because they may be at a disadvantage in certain ways. And so you do need to have national level policy at a certain point. To be honest, Yangbu, I think that that 3 decades ago in 1992, this is exactly the kind of thing that we really should have been fostering. Get this experimentation going, let 1,000 flowers bloom, figure out what works institutionally and technologically in terms of policies. But things are urgent enough now that strong national policies that can bring a whole country forward together will ultimately be needed as well. This is certainly not a problem that could be solved one small jurisdiction at a time.
So I can add briefly to that and just say, Yangbo, that is precisely my job right now, particularly in the case of adaptation. The people or the level that gets hit the worst is the local level. That's where the action needs to be. And the challenge is getting the help and the resources that are needed for local communities and states and cities to deal with the impacts of climate change. So that's the challenge that we're sort of trying to deal with now, because essentially at the UN, you have the member states. But having said that, you've had increased representation from a lot of the cities, and they're getting more and more involved. I think in the US, it's actually quite a stunning figure for the number of states that have done action plans, right? Climate action plans already. Yeah, they're quite a few. And so that is where the rubber hits the road. That's where we've got to act. That's where we've got to get the funds, and that's where the action has to take place. So you're absolutely right.
Our next question will be from Talia Weiss.
Hello. So my question is, what is the role of scientists and engineers in international climate negotiations? Usually, I know it probably differs from case to case. And how much does their engagement in negotiations typically inform outcomes, perhaps relative to how much it should inform outcomes? And that's both given the expertise of scientists and engineers, and also perhaps the ways in which it's insufficient in the context of global politics.
Sivan, I'll let you take that one.
Okay. I guess speaking as someone who's worked within the IPCC and with a research institute that works on policy, I think you can safely say that we always think we don't have enough influence, and that policymakers should listen to us more. But at the same time, I think it could probably be said, well, I think that there are some basic fundamental scientific facts now that are still very, very slowly filtering their way into policy, and that's problematic. Climate is a real problem. There's not a scientific controversy about it. It's urgent. Something needs to be done about it rapidly, and it's terribly important that basic scientific knowledge works its way into policy. But I think it's also important to recognize the bounds of science in making policy-related decisions. Much of the policy decisions that are made raise deeply value-laden issues as well. For example, we can decide that there are certain technologies that need to be deployed and implemented to the extent that that has impacts on jobs, to the extent that that has impact on cost to consumers. How are those dealt with? How are the distributional effects of climate policies to be managed? And that's something that I would say sometimes scientists think of in terms of techno-economic questions, when in fact they're not. It's not always a matter of deploying the energy technology with the lowest techno-economic cost. Sometimes the social disruption or social costs associated with a fairly deep and fundamental change are more important and need to be taken into account. So I would say that scientists should offer their expertise, policymakers should listen to them, but scientists should also be humble about the role that they should appropriately play.
Just to add briefly to that, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it is the scientists and engineers who are going to get us out of the mess that we're in. And this is what happened with the ozone treaty, if you know, the Montreal Protocol, where there were lots of governments that were against taking action in the first place because, you know, they had large companies that produced CFCs, the chemical that causes it was one of the big causes of the ozone hole. But the moment they had an alternative, they immediately wanted to take advantage of the fact that they had the alternative that the rest of the world will need, and then supported the treaty. I suspect it's going to be the same in the climate context, where when we hit that point where, you know, renewable technologies and alternatives are more lucrative and there's a vested interest in, you know, sort of putting them forward, then countries will step forward, and that's how we're going to get out of this mess. So yeah, we're relying on the scientists and the engineers.
Our final question of our program will be from Francis Jeffries.
Hello, thank you for taking my question, and thanks so much for this opportunity this morning. I'm interested in how we can address the issues of climate change and nuclear weapons, nuclear waste at the same time. Is there an opportunity to work together, or do these continue to be addressed somewhat separately?
Anju, do you have anything you want to start off with on this?
Not really, except that from what little I know about it, I think that it's not necessarily something that we're going to be able to address together, because in fact, in some contexts, nuclear energy is seen as a cleaner form of energy. So I doubt I see synergies there, but Sivan, I'm happy for you to add.
Yeah, I think maybe there are two different, at least, dimensions to this. And one is, right, what is the role of nuclear energy in dealing with climate change? My own personal feeling is that nuclear energy, yes, it may potentially offer a lower carbon source of energy, but and this is sort of implied by your question as well. There is still the problem of waste. There is still the problem of difficult to avoid interlinkages with the military system and proliferation. There's the problem of nuclear reactor safety. It's just less dangerous if a windmill tips over than if a nuclear power plant melts down. And I think the inherent dangers, in my view, suggest that no, nuclear energy is not a fundamental part of the climate solution. And then the second part having to do with nuclear weapons and nuclear conflict. I think that climate change and its disruptive potential is really serious and fundamental enough that if it leads to further destabilization of regimes, either who currently have nuclear technology that may fall out of whatever probably inadequate level of control is under now, or that spawn subnational groups that are interested in acquiring nuclear capabilities, a nuclear weapon, say, then a worsening climate really only adds to the instabilities that can make a nuclear conflict more possible. So I think there are clear links between them. As far as whether there are specific steps that could be taken that would sort of somehow come up with merged ways of dealing with the problems, I'm not sure.
Wow, very interesting thoughts about nuclear energy, given the debate about whether nuclear can be a part of the solution. In that context, I could see how you could, I don't know, if all the countries of the world decided nuclear energy is the way to get out of the climate crisis, then you could focus everything on that and maybe focus on waste, but that's probably not going to happen. We're getting near the end of our session, and I wanted to ask you both for some sort of final thoughts based both on what you heard here today and some of the notes that you've seen in our chat and the Q&A, and also again, given the really just 2 weeks now until the climate conference starts. What would you say in a sort of a concluding thought that would lend us some even more urgency to these negotiations coming up in Scotland in just a few days? Anju, would you start?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that given the nature of the agreement we have, which is largely voluntary, we as civil society, that's all of us, have a huge role to play in pushing our governments to do better and, trying to negate the influence of big vested interests that might be pushing them in a different direction. So I saw a question about that, about how do we get our governments to do something about it. So I think it's and in also sort of, once they announce commitments, in assessing them for their fairness and in pushing them to do better and take responsibility, I think that's entirely now up to us as civil society to make sure that our governments do that. So that's pretty much my advice to everyone, that we are going to have to play a larger role and take responsibility for finding a solution.
My thoughts are exactly along the same lines. One thing that Anju pointed out before is the nature of international climate cooperation that we have. It really is very different than other forms of multilateral governance that we have. Multilateral governance of trade, that's a serious system, and countries can be sanctioned. And there are investment treaties, and corporations can sue governments for depriving them of their profits. Climate change, we don't have that kind of governance regime. It really is a voluntary regime. We have not, as a world, allowed environmental issues to rise to the level of importance and prominence where it's worthy of real governance, shockingly. And so this means it really relies on us as citizens to demand of our governments that they do what's needed. Most of the attention for the last 30 years of climate policy has been on the side of reducing emissions, reducing, with energy efficiency and more renewables. There's been in comparison, there's been virtually no attention paid to the fossil fuel production side of things. And this actually, I mean, it's a little shocking that the term fossil fuels doesn't appear in the climate treaty, yet it doesn't. Renewables does and efficiency does, but fossil fuels doesn't. And yet there's a whole suite of policies that citizens could be pushing for in their own countries relating to fossil fuel production. I mentioned the Biden administration's ban on pause on additional public lands leasing. There is a divestment movement in place now. There are local local coalitions of citizens and organizations that are resisting the further investment in local fossil fuel related infrastructure. And so focusing on the supply side as well, not only is it helpful from the standpoint of starting to limit the supply of fossil fuels, but it also works toward addressing one of the sort of underlying problems, which is the financial and the political power of the fossil fuel industry that has been working very hard to maintain a fossil fuel supportive economy here, rather than climate policy. So yeah, so my parting words, just like Anju's, would be, it really is about engagement. This is a domestic action is what's needed, especially in the absence of a real binding international climate governance.
Yeah, and that would be needed now before COP and continuing after COP too. I think a lot of experts would agree.
Marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, and also not to forget to show, solidarity with people who are suffering from climate change. So that's another big piece of the picture, not to forget that there are some that have not at all contributed to this problem, but are suffering because of it. And so we need to be able to help them deal with it. That's our responsibility.
Yes, thank you very much, Anju and Sivan, for a great discussion and lots of really good and valuable information. And our time is running down, so I'd like to have Hallie come back and wrap up the program for us.
Thank you to you, Bob, to you and Sivan and Anju for this dynamic conversation, and to Bob for shepherding us through it. Don't forget to sign up now to reserve your seat for our November 9 virtual annual event, Conversations Before Midnight. More information can be found on our website, thebulletin.org. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for supporting the Bulletin and participating with us this last hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.